I'm not sure. I don't know enough about Mr. Agnew's background before, except for the general news that we had about him. He was then, by the way, supposed to be a mayor who had handled the segregation policies of Maryland rather well, that he had fought for the Negro. He was supposed to be fairly competent, but he didn't really have time to show his worth as a governor, in that he'd only been in office a limited length of time. But as far as his philosophy is concerned, I'm not sure what Mr. Agnew's philosophy is. And this is not to say this is not hitting him. It's simply we haven't received from him a series of policy statements on philosophical thinking in politics, nor do we have a book of his, nor do we have any way of judging an administration of his because he's been the vice president. Respecting some of his speeches, I find that some of the things he has pointed out are on the mark, such as the virtual monopoly of information that our major television networks have, and such as the limited exposure to opinion that we get from our major newspapers. Sir? That your opinion is shared by an awful lot of conservatives, I can say that. An awful lot of conservatives think that Mr. Agnew is supposed to keep the right happy while Mr. Nixon plays around. Sir? Well, as a conservative, I've been against the way foreign aid has been handled. All of us have been since this is the beginning of foreign aid. We felt, first of all, from the very beginning, that economic and military aid ought to be separated, that military aid ought to be part of the defense budget. That to begin with. But as much as we have been against it, and against the statist policies of foreign aid, and the way it's been a government-to-government program, which as Gunnar Myrdal, one of the greatest gurus in the liberal totem pole, has believed that, for example, he agreed in a study he wrote 3,000 pages long 2 years ago, that foreign aid has been a flop, that it has stagnated many nations through increasing their bureaucracy, that it has promoted pandemic graft in many nations, and so on. For all our objections, which have finally, after $85 billion in economic aid, have finally filtered down to liberals, I thought it was simply outrageous for the Congress to do what it did with the current foreign aid bill. You do not run a policy for 25 years and then in a 9-hour debate turn around and dump it. This is the kind of thing that upsets the conservative. You know that, you can guess that I'm against the agricultural farm subsidies, right? Do you think I'd vote against them to stop them right now? No, it would be cruel. You know I'm against Social Security. Do you think I'd have it stopped right now with a cut of a hatchet? No. There are ways of getting around these things. There are other ways of doing it, but I wouldn't do the kind of thing that liberals did with the foreign aid bill. After 25 years of supporting it as another sacred cow, of refusing to permit anybody to give a reasoned argument against the way this has been handled, all of a sudden, they turn it around in the passion of a moment, and they leave an awful lot of our programs hanging, and they leave nations who were counting on foreign aid in a state of suspension, and such nations, for example, that may have, through foreign aid, adopted faulty economic policies which have left them to stagnate economically because of our foreign aid. Such nations suddenly are left with the whole bag in their hands. Now this, I think, is irresponsible and cruel. So that I think what the Congress did a couple of weeks ago should earn, frankly, the contempt of any constituent of any congressman who voted to blow the bill that fast and that irresponsibly. Is there someone who hasn't asked a question over there? To answer your first question, I would say that the indigenous Red Indian in the United States doesn't vote unless he accepts citizenship. If he's in a reservation, he's a non-voting member of our society. He's not a citizen of our society, nor is he expected to pay the costs of our society, nor is he expected, for example, to answer the draft. Now, when he does enter society, and if he chooses to do so, and become a citizen of the United States of America, then he should receive every other benefit that we hand out to all our other citizens. Now, you're asking me, secondly, a question that you know the answer to. You know the answer. First of all, if I were a liar, I wouldn't say to you publicly that I want business to get richer and I want the poor man to starve. So in that sense, your question is useless, because if you're not going to believe my answer, which you probably don't, then why ask it, because you know that I will lie in an answer. But secondly, if I were to answer you that precisely the kind of thing conservatives are against are what liberals continue proposing, and that is the favoring of power, will you believe me? Will you believe me when it was the conservatives who voted against a subvention for Lockheed Aircraft Company? Because we feel that this is a hideous example of government subsidy of a power center. We feel that the important person here was not the Lockheed executive, nor even the Lockheed worker, but the consumer, the much greater mass, the consumer. If Lockheed was badly managed, then it should die. If Lockheed did not produce a product that consumers, that the market wanted, then it should die. For that same reason, we've been against the subventions of the textile industry and the subventions of a necessary agriculture. We don't believe that you help human beings by favoring human beings. We feel that if you favor anyone, you end up with a trust status and a vested interest, and at which point those people will never permit your regime to fail. Because we feel that what has, for example, ruined for so many years, bedeviled the economy of Europe, has been the cartel system where the king made a deal over the heads of his barons with the banks and with wealth, and produced the financial hegemony that I've seen in Spain and that still throttles Spain, as for example. You produce the kind of hegemony where power is favored, and it is our contention that to the extent that you raise big government will favor big unions and big business and conglomerates, because it's easier to deal with a few big men who themselves control great numbers of people than it is to deal with lots of thousands of smaller individuals in terms of power. And we believe that it is demonstrably, in the face of it, historically, the liberal who has promoted this centralization of power, which ultimately will become oppressive. It is a conservative, because of his philosophy, who has always distrusted that sort of concentration of power and who has voted against it everywhere he can. Sir?
Just coming here from Europe, I was fascinated by your image of the robber barons. I think your last visit must have been 12, 14.
3 weeks ago, was that 12, 14? Well, we'll take the first part of your question first, if you don't mind. I presume you come from Great Britain, and if Great Britain is an economic success today as a result of her socialization in the last 25 years, then I think it would surprise practically everybody in the world. In fact, Great Britain is economically in terribly poor shape, as we know. Now, let me ask you, what is the sense of taking an industry that is badly managed and giving it to the government to manage, when most of us know that the government is the worst of all doers? What are you doing? You're simply, instead of, for example, with the Long Island Railroad, The Long Island Railroad is a commuter line we had in the east here that was a proverbial bad railroad for years and years and years. The Long Island Railroad was losing $2 million a quarter at one point. This was about 3 years ago, I suppose. And who was suffering? Well, the stockholders of the Long Island Railroad were suffering, the managers were suffering, and the commuters were suffering. The Long Island Railroad was then taken over, and in the first year, the government running it was losing $4 million a quarter, with no increase in service and no betterment in service, but losing piles of money. Now who was suffering? Not the stockholders of the Long Island Railroad, nor the commuters who use the Long Island Railroad, but you, all of you here in Iowa, because you pay for it out of your taxes. It is child's play, it is prestidigitation to believe that because something is badly run here, that somehow miraculously it is cured when it's run from the state level or the federal level. When it is childish when we don't realize that the costs are paid by our taxes, and that we're actually paying for the inefficiency of these lines. What should have been done with the Long Island Railroad and all railroads, again, was to cut out the feather bedding of the union policies, to cut out, for example, the outdated policy that a conductor had completed a full day's work if the train had run 100 miles. This sort of thing would have been able to create the sort of capital that would have made a railroad possible. Perhaps not that particular one, but on the whole. We feel that since Mrs. Tuckman in England wrote her book on the planned society in 1934, that the whole world has advanced greatly, and we don't have to go back to 1412, nor do we have to go back to the conditions of the 1930s. Sir? So I didn't catch the first part of your question, selective service? Okay, the volunteer army was first proposed by Barry Goldwater in 1964, and McNamara laughed him out of court. It's an old conservative idea. We're against, in normal times, we're against conscription because we believe that unless the society is in declared peril, recognized by the society, such as, for example, by the Houses of Congress, then conscription is involuntary servitude. For that reason, many, many people, including the father of Carl Sandburg, came to the United States because in Scandinavia they had this involuntary servitude. So conservatives are theoretically in favor of the volunteer army, and we support it. Now, if the volunteer army that we get is unfeasible to this extent, if, for example, our world obligations, our remaining obligations, demand that we have X number of troops wherever they may be, and we get 90% of that through volunteers, and we need 10% more, then we have to make a decision. Do we want to continue our world obligations to that extent? Is it possible without danger to the whole world to reduce our obligations? And if that is not so and we must continue them, then might we have a limited selective service to make up for that 10%. We will be completely pragmatical about this. In other words, we do understand the fear that General Eisenhower spoke about in his last book before he died, when just a couple of weeks before Pearl Harbor, he counted the votes for selective service, and one vote continued it. You can understand the fears when you are facing a clear situation of confrontation. As of now, most conservatives believe, and we're not sure because we're not experts in this, this is something that we have to see whether it works or not. We believe that the volunteer army and the principle of volunteerism, if we make the army attractive enough, can bring enough volunteers into it in order to discharge our foreseeable international obligations. That may not be so if something blows up in the Middle East. I'm told that we're supposed to quit. May I quit with two things if we're supposed to quit? Okay. I think our feeling is this, and I want to express it in a story that somebody told me just before I came here to the States this time. It's a Spaniard who walks into a bar. And when he walks into that bar, he notices a man next to him who is very gloomy, sort of a morose individual. And then he looks very carefully, and he sees that that man has lost these two joints of his index finger. He only has that joint left. So he looks at him, he lifts his own index finger, he says, you and I are exactly alike, look. Well, of course, they give each other an embrace, and they buy a glass of wine. And then afterwards, the first fellow says, tell me, were you born that way too? The fellow said, no. Oh, well, he says, was it an accident? The fellow said, no. And he scratches his head and he says, well, tell me, I mean, did it have anything to do with our war? And the gloomy man said, well, I guess you could say so. He said, you see, in 1939, when Franco came to power, I began coming to this bar and saying, this can't go on. I think that's a feeling that we get when we move around in this country. We feel that we have across the Potomac a giant. We know that it's uncontrollable. We have seen the effect of its programs, and those programs we know have been generally, as the New York Times described them the other day, on the whole, said the New York Times, catastrophic. We know this. We know that this has incurred tremendous waste of resources, tremendous waste of money. We know that there have been people, there is a philosophy, offering an alternative, and offering counter-proposals. And these have not been listened to, perhaps have not been investigated sufficiently. And we do know something else, that every time we pass a law in Washington, 205 million people come under that law, and to the extent that any law has effect, some liberty goes from those 205 million individuals. So the only thing I request tonight is that when you hear of conservatism, you don't think of it as the ogre in Wall Street. That's right-wingism. But when you hear of conservatism, that you might perhaps think about it occasionally as an alternative and test it to see whether or not it may fit your idea of individual freedom and responsibility better than what we've had for the last nearly 40 years. Thank you.
Those of you that are interested in continuing discussion, the Young Americans for Freedom has coffee set up in the Oak Rooms, and Mr. Buckley will be there and be glad to talk further with any of you.